administrations. So yesterday we looked at Nixon. Today let's get started looking at Ford and Carter. So you need to be following along in your notes packet. Remember that you can use this notes packet on the test, and so you need to make sure to be answering the questions in that packet as we're going along. So like I said, today we're looking at Ford and Carter. We're going to describe the domestic and foreign policies of the Ford administration, the domestic and foreign policies of the Carter administration, and then we'll take a little bit of a detour from presidential politics and trace the rise of the environmental movement in the 1970s. So let's get started. So the Ford administration is going to begin in a really tough spot. Gerald Ford seemed to many people to be a likable and an honest man. Upon becoming vice president after Spiro Agnew's resignation, he very candidly admitted his limitations, saying that he's a Ford, not a Lincoln. On September 8, 1974, President Ford pardoned Richard Nixon in an attempt to move the country beyond Watergate. He thought that it was going to help heal the nation, that having the nation go through a very public trial of a former president would only harm us more. But in fact, what his pardoning of Nixon did was lose him significant public support. So as you can see, this was a special issue of Time magazine about the beginning of this healing process with President Ford, but many people just thought of Ford, as you can see here, as Nixon's getaway car, and resented Ford for having pardoned Nixon. Many people did not think that Nixon had committed pardonable offenses, and so they were very angry and resentful of Ford for pardoning Nixon. So under Ford, the economy is going to continue to suffer as it did under Nixon. That adds to this sense of challenge and limits of the 1970s. And by the time Ford took office, America's economy had gone from bad to worse. Inflation and unemployment both continued to rise. After the massive OPEC oil price increases in 1973, gasoline and heating oils had soared, pushing inflation from 6% to over 10% by the end of 1974. So what that means is that prices were 10% higher than they had been before, but that doesn't mean your paycheck was 10% bigger too. And so people are having to significantly cut back on their consumer spending, and a lot of times are not able to get what they need, even in terms of putting food on the table, putting gas in the car, paying the heating bill, things like that, because of how much prices have gone up. So Ford responded with a program of massive citizen action that he called Whip Inflation Now, or WIN, WIN. He called on Americans to cut back on their use of oil and gas and to try to take on other energy-saving measures. It didn't provide any sort of incentive, though. There was no motivation for people to do that. Nobody thought that anybody else was going to get on board with it, so why would you be the only person on your block trying to whip inflation now and making sacrifices when you doubt that anybody else is? And so his policy there is just going to fall flat. Ford then tried to curb inflation through a tight money policy where he cut government spending and encouraged the Federal Reserve to restrict credit through higher interest rates. But these actions just trigger the worst economic recession in 40 years. As Ford implemented his economic programs, he continually battled a Democratic Congress that was intent on pushing its own economic agenda. And during his 2 years as president, Ford vetoed more than 50 pieces of legislation. So the economy is suffering. He's battling a Democratic Congress. Just really nothing's going right for Ford on the domestic policy front. For foreign policy, Ford is going to fare slightly better in the international arena. He relied really heavily on Henry Kissinger, who continued to be the Secretary of State. He mostly carried out Nixon's foreign policy. He pushed ahead with Nixon's policy of negotiation with China and the Soviet Union. In November of 1974, he met with the Soviet premier, and less than a year later, he traveled to Helsinki, Finland, where 35 nations, including the Soviet Union, signed the Helsinki Accords, which were a series of agreements that promised greater cooperation between the nations of the Eastern and Western Hemisphere. And the Helsinki Accords really would be Ford's greatest presidential accomplishment. There was a lot of ongoing turmoil in Southeast Asia. Like presidents before him, Ford is confronted with the problems of the Vietnam War. In 1973, the ceasefire in Vietnam had broken down, heavy fighting resumed, and Ford asked Congress for over $722 million to help South Vietnam, but this time Congress refused. Without American financial help, South Vietnam surrendered to the North in 1975, as we have discussed. In that same year, the communist government of Cambodia seized the U.S. merchant ship, the Mayaguez, in the Gulf of Siam. President Ford responded with a massive show of military force to rescue 39 crew members aboard the ship, but the operation cost the lives of 41 U.S. troops. And so many people were critical of Ford's decision, arguing that the mission had cost more lives than it had actually saved. So all of this leads us to the 1976 presidential race. The Republicans are going to nominate Gerald Ford for president after fending off a powerful conservative challenge from former governor of California, Ronald Reagan. We'll see him again later. Because the Republicans seemed divided over Ford's leadership, the Democrats confidently eyed the White House. One Democratic leader even said, "We could run an aardvark this year and win." And in many ways they did run an aardvark when they nominated an unknown peanut farmer and former governor of Georgia, Jimmy Carter. Now, Jimmy Carter actually had a lot more going for him than just being a peanut farmer. He was a rocket scientist, and he did have diplomatic experience, but he was definitely an outsider. And so let's now look at the Carter administration. So during the post-Watergate era, cynicism toward Washington and the Washington establishment ran really high. So that's kind of how this soft-spoken, personable man from Plains, Georgia, got to be president. He promised to restore integrity to the nation's highest office, promising to never tell a lie to the American people. Throughout the presidential campaign, Carter and Ford squared off over the key issues of the campaign, which were inflation, energy, and unemployment. On Election Day, Jimmy Carter won by a narrow margin, claiming 40.8 million popular votes to Ford's 39.1 million. From the very beginning, the new First Family brought a down-to-earth style to Washington. After settling into office, Carter stayed in touch with the people by holding very Roosevelt-like fireside chats on radio and and television. Carter failed to reach out to Congress in a similar way, though. He refused to play the insider game of deal-making. He relied mainly on a team of advisors from Georgia, and he even alienated the congressional Democrats of his own party. Both parties on Capitol Hill were often joining together to sink the president's budget proposals, as well as his major policy reforms in tax and welfare programs. So he really just wasn't ready to play the Washington political game that, unfortunately, it takes to make politics in our country. So let's look at now the domestic policy of the Carter administration. So like Gerald Ford, Carter focused a lot of his attention on battling the country's energy and economic crises, but much like his predecessor, was unable to bring the U.S. out of its economic slump. So first, let's look at the energy crisis. Carter considered the energy crisis the most important issue facing the nation. A large part of the problem, he believed, was America's reliance on imported oil, and so he began to encourage Americans to cut their consumption of oil and gas. In addition to encouraging that from the American people, he also presented Congress with more than 100 proposals on energy conservation and development. Representatives from the oil and gas producing states fiercely resisted some of his proposals because they would have lost him money. Automobile manufacturers also lobbied against gas rationing provisions because it takes gas to run a car, and auto manufacturers want people to buy cars. Carter said, "It was impossible for me to imagine the bloody legislative battles we would have to win." Out of these battles came the National Energy Act. It placed a tax on gas-guzzling cars, removed price controls on oil and natural gas produced in the United States to try to get people to buy that gas as opposed to foreign gas, and it also extended tax credits for the development of alternative energy. So with the help of this act, as well as voluntary conservation measures, U.S. dependence on foreign oil had eased slightly by 1979. Looking now at Carter and the economic crisis. So unfortunately, the energy-saving measures did not do much to combat a sudden new economic crisis. In the summer of 1979, renewed violence in the Middle East produced a second major fuel shortage in the U.S., and to make matters worse, OPEC announced another major price hike. So in 1979, inflation soared from 7.6% to 11.3%. Faced with increasing pressure to do something about this, Carter attempted lots of different measures. None of them really worked. He had a very scattershot approach that convinced a lot of people that he didn't really have an economic policy at all. He fueled this feeling of uncertainty by delivering his now famous Malaise speech, where he complained about a crisis of spirit that had struck at the very heart and soul of our national will. His address made many Americans feel that their president had given up. And, whether that was true or not, you don't really want to hear your president say it, right? Like, many people would have agreed with him that there was a crisis in America, but nobody wants the leader of your country to come out and say, yeah, we've got problems. They want to see confidence, they want to see action, and that is not what Carter provided for the people. By 1980, inflation had climbed to nearly 14%, which was the highest rate since 1947, which was right after all the price controls from World War II expired. So that's pretty high prices if you're competing with that post-World War II era. The standard of living in the U.S. slipped from first place to fifth place in the world, and Carter's popularity slipped along with it. This economic downswing and Carter's inability to solve it during an election year is one key factor that sent Ronald Reagan to the White House after Carter. So one thing that Carter did decently is his legacy with civil rights. So he took a special pride in his civil rights record. His administration included more African Americans and women than any other administration before it. In 1977, he appointed civil rights leader Andrew Young as the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. He was the first African American to hold that post. And in the judicial branch alone, Carter appointed 28 African Americans, 29 women, and 14 Latinos. So he did feel like he had a pretty positive civil rights legacy, but he fell short of what many civil rights groups had expected in terms of legislation. Critics claimed that Carter, when he was preoccupied with battles over energy and the economy, failed to give civil rights his full attention, and in that time the courts began to dismantle affirmative action, with Carter taking no action there. So he has a very mixed civil rights legacy. We also need to talk about Carter's foreign policy. So Carter was basing his foreign policy on human rights. So he rejected the Nixon philosophy of realpolitik, which was the policy of negotiating with powerful nations despite their behavior, that you really only care about their power. And he strove for a foreign policy that was based on human rights, like freedoms and liberties that are listed in the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights. Basically, he wanted us to only negotiate or work with countries that were promoting human rights within their countries. So putting this policy into practice, he cut off military aid to Argentina and Brazil, which were countries that had had good relations to the U.S., but had imprisoned or tortured thousands of their own citizens. He followed up this action by establishing a Bureau of Human Rights in the State Department. People were critical of Carter's human rights. Some people still supported our containment policy and thought that this human rights-based policy undercut our allies like Nicaragua, which was a dictatorial but anti-communist country. Some people argued that we were supporting dictators in South Korea and the Philippines, and that by doing that, Carter was acting inconsistently, and so his plans did draw some criticism. One plan that was very critical, or people that were very critical of it, was when we yielded the Panama Canal. So since 1914, the U.S. had obtained full ownership over the Panama Canal, and Panamanians had resented having their nation split in half by a foreign power. In 1977, the two nations agreed to two treaties, one of which turned over control of the Panama Canal to Panama. Public opinion was very much divided over this, but in the end, the treaties did improve relationships between the U.S. and Latin America. So when Jimmy Carter took office, détente, or the relaxation of tensions between the world superpowers, had reached a high point. Beginning with President Nixon and continuing with President Ford, U.S. officials had worked to ease relations with communist superpowers like China and the Soviet Union. But Carter's firm insistence on human rights led to a breakdown in relations with the Soviet Union. President Carter did not like the Soviet Union's treatment of dissidents or opponents of the government's policies, and his issues led to a delay in the second round of the SALT negotiations. President Carter and the Soviet premier did finally meet in June of '79 in Vienna, where they signed an agreement called SALT II. It didn't reduce armaments, but did provide limits on the number of strategic weapons and nuclear missile launchers that each side could produce. The SALT II agreement met sharp opposition in the Senate and was never actually ratified, and that treaty died. So there was ongoing turmoil in the Middle East. Through negotiation and arm twisting, though, Carter helped forge peace between longtime enemies Israel and Egypt. In 1977, Egyptian president and Israeli prime minister met in Jerusalem to begin discussing an overall peace between the two nations. In the summer of 1978, Carter seized on the peace initiative. When the peace talks stalled, he invited both leaders to Camp David, which is the presidential retreat. And after 12 days of intense negotiations, they reached an agreement that became known as the Camp David Accords. This is the first signed peace agreement with an Arab country, and in it, Israel agreed to withdraw from the Sinai Peninsula, where it had captured Egypt during the Six-Day War in 1967, and Egypt in turn formally recognized Israel's right to exist. So that is seen as a pretty big victory for Carter. But by 1979, there were issues with Iran. So the leader of Iran, who was an ally of the U.S., was in deep trouble in 1979. Many Iranians resented his regime's widespread corruption and dictatorial tactics. In January of '79, revolution broke out, and the Muslim religious leader Ayatollah Khomeini led the rebels in overthrowing the Shah and establishing a religious state based on strict obedience to the Quran. Carter had supported the Shah until the very end, and in '79, the president allowed the Shah to enter the U.S. for cancer treatment, and he had already fled from Iran at that point. Allowing him to enter the U.S. infuriated the revolutionaries, and on November 4th of '79, armed students seized the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and took 52 Americans hostage. They demanded that the U.S. send the Shah back to Iran in return for the release of the hostages. Carter refused, and a painful year-long standoff followed, where the U.S. continued quiet but intense efforts to free the hostages. The captives were finally released on January 20th, 1981, shortly after the new President Ronald Reagan was sworn in. So despite the hostages' release after 444 days in captivity, The crisis in Iran seemed to underscore the limits that Americans faced during the 1970s. And a lot of being fed up with those limits is what's going to lead to the defeat of Carter as the Democratic nominee in the 1980 presidential race by Republican Ronald Reagan. So another sense of unease or discontent that Americans are going to feel in the 1970s is going to lead to environmental activism. So the roots of environmentalism is very much to do with a book called Silent Spring. So this was a book that was released in 1962 by a lady named Rachel Carson. She was a marine biologist. And in this book, she warned against the growing use of pesticides. She argued that pesticides poisoned the food that they were intended to protect, and as a result killed many birds and fish. She cautioned that Americans faced a silent spring where birds were killed off by pesticides and would no longer fill the air with song unless we changed our ways. She said that all of the weapons used in man's war against nature, that pesticides were the most harmful. Within 6 months of its publication, Silent Spring sold nearly 500,000 copies. Many chemical companies called the book inaccurate and threatened legal action, but for a majority of Americans, Carson's book was an early warning about the danger that human activity posed to the environment. Shortly after the book's publication, President Kennedy established an advisory committee to investigate this environmental situation. With Rachel Carson's prodding, the nation slowly began to focus more on environmental issues. Although Carson would not live to see the U.S. outlaw DDT in 1972, it was her work that helped many Americans realize that their everyday behavior, as well as the nation's industrial growth, had a damaging effect on the environment. So during the 1970s, we're going to see the first Earth Day established on April 22nd, 1970. And that is going to help usher in this new decade of environmentalism. So nearly every community in the nation and more than 10,000 schools and 2,000 colleges hosted some type of environmental awareness activity and spotlighted problems like pollution, the growth of toxic waste, and Earth's dwindling resources. And Earth Day celebrations continue today. Each year on April 22nd, millions of people around the world gather to heighten public awareness of environmental problems. So although President Nixon was not considered an environmentalist or someone who takes an active role in the protection of the environment, he recognized the nation's growing concerns about the environment. And in an effort to make our peace with nature, as he said, he set out on a course that led to the passage of several landmark measures. In 1970, he consolidated 15 existing federal pollution programs into the Environmental Protection Agency. It was given the power to set and enforce pollution standards, to conduct environmental research, and to assist state and local governments in pollution control. Today, the EPA remains the federal government's main instrument for dealing with environmental issues, but the future of it is very much to be determined under the current presidential administration. In 1970, Nixon signed a new Clean Air Act that added several amendments to the Clean Air Act of 1963. It gave the government the authority to set clean air standards. Congress also passed the Endangered Species Act, which added or limited pesticide use and curbed strip mining to help protect species. So we also had an incident in the 1970s that renewed the debate over nuclear power and the safety of nuclear power for the environment, and that was the incident at 3 Mile Island. So this was a nuclear plant in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania that in March of '79 malfunctioned. The reactor overheated its cooling system and its cooling system failed, and people freaked out that radiation would escape and spread over the region. 2 days later, low-level radiation actually did escape from the broken reactor. Officials had to evacuate some residents while some people fled on their own. In all, more than 100,000 residents were evacuated from the surrounding area, and on April 9th, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission announced that the immediate danger was over. But the events at 3 Mile Island rekindled the debate over nuclear power. Supporters of nuclear power said that no one had been killed or seriously injured, but opponents said that the chance alone was not okay. They demanded that the government call a halt to construction of new power plants and gradually shut down existing nuclear facilities. The government did not shut down the nuclear facilities or do away with nuclear power, but federal officials did recognize nuclear energy's potential danger to both humans and the environment. And as a result of the accident at 3 Mile Island, a nuclear regulatory commission was set up and strengthened its safety standards and improved inspection procedures. So environmental activism is a continuing movement. A lot of the current debate is over environmental regulations and how that threatens capitalism, but then how industry threatens the environment. So the current situation is sort of capitalism versus environmentalism, and the future of the environmental movement is very much to be determined. Okay, so what you're going to be doing now is actually reading a portion of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, and there's some questions in your packet with the reading for you to answer. When you're done with that, you need to do your comp check, and then that is all for today. Thanks, guys.